Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments. The frontier sun burned low over the far horizon, spilling long streaks of copper and ochre. Across the rugged desert plains, the land was a quiet mixture of dust, wind, and whispered stories carried from campfire to campfire, town to town, cattle trail to empty canyon. Within this land, men hardened by survival roamed in search of fortune or redemption, and women were often swept into lives carved not by choice but by circumstance. The world of the American Southwest had no gentle edges, only sharp destinies waiting to shape those who dared walk upon it. It was within this merciless world that the path of a drifting cowboy would cross that of an enslaved Apache woman, whose spirit remained unbroken. The cowboy had no name to most who met him. They called him the rider, the drifter, or simply the man with tired boots. He entered towns without leaving memories, and he left towns without taking anything but dust on his coat. Yet, beneath the dust and hardened expression, existed a heart that had not completely surrendered to the world's cruelty. That heart still pulsed, slower, heavier but alive, and waiting for something worth its last beat. He arrived in the mining town of Red Crossing on a late summer evening, limping slightly from a long ride across cliffs that hardly deserved to be called trails. His horse was exhausted, ribs showing, eyes heavy, yet loyal. The cowboy himself carried no more than a worn saddlebag, an empty canteen, and a single dollar hidden inside his boot, the last dollar he possessed in a world that demanded a price for every breath. Red Crossing was a place where gold dust often stained the dreams of men, and sins trailed behind every saloon door. The wooden buildings leaned as if trying to escape the desert winds, and a haze of smoke and sweat filled the air. And in the very center of this rough settlement stood an auction platform where human suffering was displayed as a spectacle for men who believed their gold gave them power over others. The cowboy had no intention of stopping near that platform. He wanted only water for his horse, a meal for himself, and perhaps one night beneath an actual roof instead of open sky. But fate has a way of turning a man's head even when he does not wish it to turn, for on that platform stood a woman. Her wrists were bound, her ankles bruised, her hair tangled from rough handling, yet her eyes, dark, fiery, unyielding, held a dignity that defied the chains around her. She was Apache, unmistakably so, but worn by exhaustion and mistreatment. The auctioneer shouted of her strength, her endurance, her usefulness, like she was livestock instead of a living soul. Men in the crowd murmured, inspected, calculated, and exchanged cruel glances. The cowboy felt something shift inside him. Perhaps it was anger at the cruelty on display, or perhaps it was the sudden recognition of a spirit refusing to break. He had seen so many broken by the frontier, men, women, even children, but this woman's gaze struck him like a hammer. She did not look away from the crowd, she did not plead. She simply stood, breathing dust and humiliation, daring the world to crush her. The cowboy had no money to intervene. He knew it. He felt the single dollar in his boot like a cruel joke. He told himself to turn away, to walk toward the saloon or the stables, to remind himself that he had no place in the suffering of strangers. The world had hardened him, but not enough to numb his conscience entirely, and that conscience now battled within him like a restless stallion. The auctioneer continued, growing impatient with the crowd. Bids trickled in, small, insulting amounts tossed without care. The cowboy sensed the men's intentions. None planned to treat her with the smallest thread of humanity. She would be taken to a place darker than the one she already stood upon. The cowboy swallowed, feeling the dryness in his throat. He had lost everything over the years: land, livestock, friends, hopes of a fresh start. He had just $1 left to his name, $1 that could buy barely a drink, barely a meal, barely a chance of survival. And yet, he found his boots moving toward the platform, driven by something deeper than logic. He stepped forward, unaware of how desperate or foolish he appeared. His clothes were worn, his horse starving, and he looked like a man who couldn't afford even his own shadow. The auctioneer sneered. The crowd chuckled, but the cowboy didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed only on the woman, on the quiet resilience in her posture. He lifted his hand. The crowd laughed louder, thinking it a joke. The auctioneer mocked him, but the cowboy remained still, steady, as if rooted into the wooden planks beneath him. A murmur swept through the men, a mixture of amusement and disbelief. He could offer nothing. He should have been invisible. Yet he stood there, refusing to lower his hand. The auctioneer, irritated and bored, finally slammed his hand onto the podium. There were no higher bids, not because the men lacked money, but because none cared enough to offer more. The cowboy's single dollar, exposed at last, became the highest bid by default. The crowd roared with laughter. They saw a fool. They saw a hopeless man throwing away his last coin on what they considered worthless property. But the cowboy didn't hear them. All he saw was the woman being cut free, her chains falling on the platform. He stepped forward to claim the only thing he had ever bought with his final dollar. Not a horse, not a weapon, not a meal, but the freedom of another human being. The Apache woman did not thank him. She did not smile. She simply looked at him, studying him with wary distance. She did not understand why a broken cowboy would waste his final dollar on her. She expected a demand, an expectation, a price for her freedom. But when none came, confusion flickered behind her guarded gaze. They walked away from the platform slowly, step by heavy step, as if crossing through layers of dust and disbelief. Behind them, the crowd lost interest. To them, the cowboy gained nothing but another burden. To them, the Apache woman had merely been transferred from one form of captivity to another. They assumed the cowboy would treat her no better than the world had already treated her. But the cowboy led her to his horse, offered her water, and gave her space. He said nothing because he had nothing to offer but his silence. The woman watched him with a mixture of suspicion and surprise. She had known cruelty, violence, and betrayal from those who held power, but she had rarely seen compassion, especially from a stranger who had nothing left to give. Night settled over Red Crossing like a cloak. The cowboy made a small fire on the outskirts of town, near a line of rocks that shielded them from the worst of the wind. He ate nothing. His hunger clawed at his stomach. Instead, he handed the little food he had left to the woman. She accepted it slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether the gesture was real. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing bruises and exhaustion, but also strength. She kept her distance, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and watching the cowboy from behind cautious eyes. She had been traded, beaten, silenced, stripped of her tribe, her past, and her identity, but her spirit had not been defeated. The cowboy rested beside the fire, staring into the flames, unable to shake the realization that he had given away the last thing he owned. He had nothing left, not money, not security, not a plan for tomorrow, but strangely, he did not regret it. He had rescued a stranger, and something deep within told him the act would matter far more than the dollar he lost. As the night deepened, a cold wind swept across the open plains. The Apache woman shifted closer to the fire, then closer still, until she sat near enough to share its warmth. She did not trust the cowboy, but she recognized that he had done something no one else had ever done, spent his last remaining thread of survival to give her a chance at her own. The desert grew quiet. The cowboy closed his eyes briefly, exhausted, and in that silence, the woman watched him. The man who had nothing yet gave everything. A thought took shape in her mind, heavy and unexpected, shaped by survival, tradition, and an unspoken code of honor. It was a thought that would change both their lives, and before dawn's first light, she understood it fully. A man who spends his last dollar on you becomes bound to your destiny, and in her world, bound destiny carried great weight. The dawn rose slowly over the barren desert plains. casting light across the scattered rocks, sagebrush, and the fading embers of the cowboy's small campfire. The Apache woman sat awake long before the sun broke free from the eastern ridge, her posture steady and unmoving, like a silent guardian watching both the land and the man who slept near the dying flames. The night had been long, cold, and unsettled, but her mind had remained fiercely alert. Her freedom was fragile, like a wind-blown ember that might be extinguished at any moment, yet she remained, tied not by rope or fear, but by a thought that she could no longer ignore. The cowboy stirred beneath his thin blanket. He rose slowly, every bone in his body stiff from the rough desert ground. His hunger gnawed at him with sharp insistence. He had surrendered his food to her the previous night, and now only thirst and fatigue filled him. He said nothing as he rose and dusted off his coat. He glanced at the Apache woman with the same quiet respect he had shown the night before. She returned the look with her fierce yet unreadable gaze. A faint trail of smoke drifted up from the fire pit, and the woman added a few dry twigs, coaxing the flames back to life. The cowboy noticed the simple gesture and felt a small shift inside him. Not gratitude, but a strange sense of companionship he had long forgotten. For years he had ridden alone, trusting only the dust, the sky, and the weary hooves of his horse. But now there was another presence in the quiet morning, one that unsettled and steadied him. At the same time, the sun rose higher, painting the desert in gold. The woman stood, her form tall and slender, wrapped in the blanket the cowboy had offered. Her skin held the marks of hardship, and her wrists carried the raw irritation of her previous bindings. But despite her physical wounds, her posture radiated strength. She walked toward a nearby rise in the land, studying the horizon, scanning the distant hills as if calculating their next step. The cowboy packed the few things he still owned: his saddlebag, his blanket, a rusted tin cup, and a rope frayed nearly to uselessness. His horse nickered softly as he checked its hooves, its ribs still showing but its spirit holding on. When he finished, he looked toward the Apache woman, unsure whether she meant to stay or leave. She had the right to walk away now. She owed him nothing. Yet she returned to the campfire with steady steps. She lowered herself onto one knee beside him, not as a gesture of submission, but as an act of purpose. The cowboy watched her carefully, sensing that something significant hung in the stillness between them. Her eyes, dark and strong, carried an intensity that made him brace as though facing a sudden storm. The woman had thought through the night, weighed tradition, honor, and the unspoken rules of her people. In her tribe, a man who gave his life's last possession for woman, especially for her freedom, created a sacred duty. It meant he had placed her life above his own survival. It meant he had chosen her fate over his security. And in the Apache world, such sacrifices were never ignored, never dismissed, never forgotten. She laid her hand lightly on her stomach, her gaze steady as ever. Her thoughts shaped themselves into a vow, one rooted in ancient ways and tribal law. In her culture, life debts were not paid with coins or labor. They were paid with bloodlines, continuity, and the binding of futures. A man who saved a woman at his own cost was not merely a rescuer. He became tied to her destiny, and she in turn carried the responsibility of giving him legacy. This vow formed slowly within her, and when the moment came to accept it fully, she did so without hesitation. The cowboy did not yet understand the meaning behind her expression. He only sensed that she was making a decision that reached far beyond the simple act of sharing his camp. She rose, gathering her hair behind her shoulders, and walked toward the stream that cut through the valley near their camp. The cowboy followed at a respectful distance, unsure of her intentions but unwilling to let danger fall upon her. Coyotes prowled these plains. Outlaws passed through without warning. Apache captives were valuable to the wrong men. He knew the risks even if she did not speak them aloud. The woman knelt by the stream, washing the dust and blood from her wrists. She dipped her hands into the cold water, then splashed it across her face, letting it drip down her chin. The cowboy watched her from the edge of the bank, noticing the quiet dignity in her movements. She carried herself not as a slave, but as someone who still possessed control over her soul. When she finally stood, she turned toward him once more. The sun framed her silhouette, casting a glow around her form. The cowboy felt a strange tightening in his chest, not born from desire, but from the weight of something far greater, an understanding that was beginning to surface slowly, like a long, buried truth rising from shallow earth. They returned to the horse together. The woman placed her hand upon the animal's neck, recognizing the creature's exhaustion and offering silent gratitude. The cowboy motioned for her to ride, knowing the horse could not carry them both far, but that she needed the strength more than he did. She understood his gesture and mounted with minimal effort, despite her fatigue. The cowboy walked beside the horse, guiding them toward the open desert road. Each step marked the beginning of a journey neither had planned. The woman watched him from above, analyzing the contours of his face, the steady rhythm of his steps, the quiet endurance in his posture. She saw not a weak man, but a man stripped of everything except his integrity. And in her world, integrity was more valuable than gold, more binding than any chain. Hours passed in silence. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant pines. The cowboy scanned the horizon for threats, always alert, always wary. The woman studied him, waiting for the right moment to give voice to the vow she had formed. Her promise was not driven by romance or affection, but by duty, culture, and the ancient laws of her people. When the sun reached its zenith, they stopped beneath a cluster of rocky outcroppings that offered shade. The cowboy rested against one stone, fatigue pulling at him. The woman dismounted, stood before him, and let the full weight of her decision settle into the space between them. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see every line of determination etched into her features. For a long moment, neither moved, the wind carrying sand around their feet. She placed a palm gently over her stomach again, not out of weakness, but as a declaration of intent. The cowboy felt the shift instantly. He realized that she was making a choice that would entwine their futures permanently, a choice shaped by culture deeper than the desert itself. Though she did not speak, the meaning was unmistakable, carried in her eyes, in her posture, in the quiet gravity of her presence. She was vowing to bear him a child, not as an act of love, not as an act of surrender, but as an act of honor. The cowboy inhaled softly, taken aback by the enormity of what she offered. He understood the responsibility such a vow implied. It meant that their fates, once separate, once wandering, were no longer walking apart. It meant that a single dollar had bought something far greater than he had ever imagined. It meant that the woman he saved had bound her destiny to his with an oath that could not be undone. The desert wind swept between them, carrying away the dust, but leaving the weight of the vow unshaken. In that silent exchange, their journey truly began. The rocky shelter beneath which the cowboy and the Apache woman stood held a silence heavy enough to echo. The woman's vow, unspoken yet unmistakable, hung in the air like the dust suspended in the midday heat. The cowboy felt the weight of her intention settle into his bones, deeper than any hardship the frontier had inflicted upon him before. He had lived through storms of bullets, hunger, betrayal, and loneliness, but nothing had prepared him for the sudden certainty that another person had bound her future to his. The Apache woman, having accepted her ancestral duty, stood with the stillness of a mountain. Her vow had been made through instinct, tradition, and spiritual law forces older than the country around them. She did not tremble or hesitate. Her decision was carved from the same stone that shaped her people's survival. The cowboy, however, felt something shift inside him, an unease that was not fear, but the awakening of a responsibility he had never imagined taking on. As the heat of the afternoon grew, the woman returned to the horse and placed her hand on its side, feeling the animal's breath. The cowboy retrieved his canteen, shaking it gently. Only a few drops remained. Without hesitation, he handed it to her. The woman accepted the offering, took a small sip, then returned the container to him with equal restraint. Their shared thirst created a silent acknowledgment of their intertwined fates. The desert stretched before them, like an endless sea of gold and gray. The cowboy knew they needed water, food, and direction. The nearest settlement was a 2-day walk, and his horse barely had the strength for another mile. Yet, he did not voice his doubts. He simply placed his hand on the horse's bridle and began walking. The Apache woman followed beside him, matching his pace with determined steps. As the sun began its slow descent, they reached a valley where scattered mesquite trees cast thin shadows over the earth. The cowboy recognized signs of life: rabbit tracks, bird feathers, and distant rustling in the brush. He knelt down, analyzing the ground with practiced eyes. The woman observed him quietly, recognizing that his experience with the frontier was as deep as hers, though shaped by a different world. She watched how he studied the trail, how he softened his footsteps, how he listened to the silence for what it concealed. The cowboy motioned for them to stay. He moved through the brush with quiet precision. Moments later, he returned with a small desert hare, caught using a snare he crafted from a frayed rope. It was not much, but it was food, perhaps enough to keep them alive through the night. The woman gathered dry sticks and stones, building a fire in a circular pit, as her ancestors had taught her. The cowboy skinned the hare with the blade he kept hidden in his boot, then placed the meat over the fire. The scent of cooking meat filled the valley, drifting across the wind and drawing the attention of lurking predators. The woman's keen eyes scanned the shadows, while the cowboy watched the ridgelines for trouble. Their survival instincts, sharpened by different lives, blended seamlessly in the quiet cooperation of necessity. When the meat finished cooking, the cowboy divided it carefully, giving her the larger portion. The woman ate with silent gratitude, her body regaining some of its lost strength. The cowboy consumed his share slowly, despite his gnawing hunger. The flames cast long shadows against the rocks, painting the two wanderers in hues of red and gold. As night fell, they gathered around the fire. The cowboy noticed how the woman sat closer to him than the night before, not out of fear or dependence, but because her vow had already begun to shape her actions. She remained vigilant, her gaze sweeping the darkness, but her presence beside him felt less like distance and more like connection. The cowboy felt the desert cold seep through his clothes. He closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him into uneasy rest. The woman remained awake a little longer, her thoughts drifting into memories of her people, her mother braiding her hair by the fire, her father teaching her the meaning of strength. Her tribe gathered beneath the moon in celebration, all of them gone now, taken by violence or scattered across lands that did not belong to them. She felt a sting in her chest, but she steadied her breath, grounding herself in the vow she had chosen. Eventually, she too rested, though lightly, ready to wake at the slightest noise. By dawn, they resumed their journey. The cowboy walked with quiet determination, though the heat and fatigue gnawed deeper into him. The Apache woman studied him closely, noting how he hid his exhaustion behind discipline. She understood the subtleties of suffering. She had endured it her entire life. But she sensed that the cowboy now walked for her as much as for himself. It was a realization that strengthened the certainty of her vow. As noon approached, the land shifted. The flat dunes gave way to a canyon carved by centuries of wind and seasonal rains. A narrow stream trickled along the canyon floor, a thin ribbon of life in a land that offered little mercy. Relief washed through them, both when they saw the glint of water. The cowboy hurried to the stream and dunked his hands into the cool flow, drinking deeply. The woman knelt beside him, cupping water in her palms and sipping with measured grace. The horse drank greedily, nearly stumbling from relief. They filled the canteen, washed away grit from their skin, and soaked their clothes enough to cool the relentless heat. For a moment the cowboy allowed himself to breathe. The stream was salvation, however brief, but the woman's instincts pulled her attention elsewhere. She examined the canyon walls, the broken stones, and the unusual quiet that fell over the place. Her senses sharpened. Something felt wrong. The cowboy noticed her tension and scanned the surroundings. The jagged cliffs and narrow passages made them vulnerable. The air carried a faint stillness that often preceded danger. The woman placed her palm against the ground, feeling for vibrations. When she lifted her head, her eyes hardened. Something, or someone, was approaching. The cowboy led the horse toward a recess in the canyon wall. The woman followed, her body drawn taut by instinct. The cowboy reached for the only weapon he had, a rusted knife, sharpened by necessity. The woman armed herself with a smooth stone she had retrieved from the stream. Though crude, she knew how to use it with deadly precision. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then the sound arrived, distant hoofbeats echoing through the canyon. The cowboy recognized the rhythm, horses moving fast, riders traveling with purpose. The woman's breath stilled. These were not weary travelers. The pace was too aggressive, too coordinated. The echoes grew louder, bouncing off the canyon walls until the sound surrounded them. The cowboy looked to the woman. Acknowledging the same thought they shared, someone was tracking them, perhaps slavers from Red Crossing, furious that their property had been taken, perhaps bandits who had seen the auction and decided the cowboy's new companion was worth stealing, perhaps someone from the woman's own past returning to reclaim her in chains. Whatever the reason, the danger was real, and it was closing in fast. The cowboy motioned for the woman to climb onto the horse once more. The animal hesitated, still weak, but the cowboy whispered reassurance it could not hear but somehow felt. The woman mounted swiftly, her eyes scanning the cliff tops. The cowboy took the reins and led them through the narrowest part of the canyon, hoping to escape before the riders reached them. The hoofbeats quickened. The canyon narrowed further. The cowboy's pulse surged, and behind him the sound of approaching danger grew louder and louder, until it swallowed the quiet morning entirely. The echo of hoofbeats thundered through the twisting canyon walls, growing stronger and sharper as the pursuers closed in. The cowboy tightened his grip on the horse's reins, urging the exhausted animal forward. Apache woman, perched lightly on the horse's back, kept her gaze firmly fixed behind them, watching the dust clouds rising through the narrow pass. Her instincts sharpened with every approaching sound. She recognized pursuit when she heard it, and this was no random patrol or wandering traveler. This was the calculated gallop of men who had purpose and greed driving their steps. The canyon floor offered little room to maneuver. Sheer rock walls rose on both sides, towering overhead like jagged stone giants watching their frantic escape. Loose gravel and uneven ground threatened to bring the horse down at any misstep, yet the cowboy led them with precision born from a lifetime of navigating treacherous terrain. His boots struck the ground with relentless rhythm, his breath strained but steady, his focus unwavering. The woman observed how his shoulders tightened, how his steps quickened without panic, and how he kept his head angled just enough to study the path ahead. She understood that this man, who had spent his last dollar to save her, now risked far more than money. He risked his life, his last scraps of strength, and whatever future he still clung to. As the canyon weaved deeper between the cliffs, the path widened. The cowboy seized the opportunity to mount behind the woman, slipping onto the saddle with controlled urgency. The horse groaned beneath added weight but continued forward, driven by instinct and the rough encouragement of its rider. The woman adjusted her position, balancing herself to reduce the strain on the animal. Behind them, the riders emerged through the swirling dust. The cowboy turned his head long enough to confirm what he already suspected: 3 men, armed, riding with the unmistakable hunger of those who hunted, both for profit and cruelty. Their silhouettes grew larger with each heartbeat, their outlines blurring in the haze of heat and pursuit. The Apache woman recognized one of them. She saw the broad shoulders, the cruel slouch, the way he held his rifle angled over his saddle. The man had been at the auction, the same one who had bid on her with impatience and hostility. She remembered the greedy gleam in his eyes, the way he had viewed her as nothing more than a commodity. Now he led the chase, determined to reclaim what he believed he had been cheated out of. The horse pushed through the canyon, but its strength waned. Each stride grew heavier, its breath labored. The cowboy felt the trembling beneath him and knew the animal could not outrun mounted pursuers for long. He pulled lightly on the reins, steering them toward a jagged crevice that branched off from the main canyon, a narrow passage barely wide enough for the horse. The woman sensed his intention and braced herself as the horse squeezed through the rocky gap. The canyon walls closed around them like the inside of a stone throat. Sharp rocks scraped their legs, and the horse's hooves slipped on uneven ground, but they pressed on. The narrow passage twisted like a serpent, making it impossible for the riders behind to follow at full speed. The cowboy knew this would slow the pursuers, but not stop them. He nudged the horse forward, urging it to maintain whatever strength it had left. The crevice opened into a small basin surrounded by boulders and thorny shrubs. A sliver of sky cut across the top, sending a blade of light onto the sandy floor. The air here was cooler, shaded, carrying the faint scent of water and desert flowers. The Apache woman scanned the basin for an escape route. She spotted a steep incline leading up the rocks, jagged but climbable. The cowboy slid off the horse and steadied the trembling animal. Sweat dripped from his brow, and dust clung to his skin. His breathing grew shallow, but determination radiated from every movement. The woman dismounted beside him and motioned toward the incline. The cowboy nodded, guiding the horse toward a cluster of thorn bushes where it might remain hidden if the pursuers scanned the area. The riders' voices echoed faintly in the distance, distorted by the canyon walls. The cowboy felt the tension coil inside him, like a rattlesnake ready to strike. The woman's heart drummed in her chest, but her expression stayed steady, formed by years of enduring trials far worse than men on horseback. Together, they began climbing the rock incline. The cowboy's boots slipped on loose stones, and his muscles strained under the combined exhaustion of hunger, dehydration, and fear. The woman ascended with remarkable agility, helping guide him to more stable footholds. Despite her fatigue, her movements carried the precision of someone raised among mountains and cliffs. She paused occasionally, offering her hand to steady him, though she did not speak. Her vow carried through the gesture. The top of the incline offered a narrow ledge with a concealed vantage point. From there, they could watch the basin, while remaining hidden among jagged stones. The cowboy crouched behind a large boulder, gripping his rusted knife. It was a pitiful weapon against armed riders, but he held it with firm resolve. Apache woman positioned herself beside him, gripping the smooth stone she had taken earlier, a tool she knew how to use with lethal skill if forced to fight. The first rider entered the basin moments later. The man dismounted, scanning the ground with impatience. Dust clung to his face, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. He kicked at the soil, searching for tracks, then inspected the bushes. The cowboy watched every movement, his heartbeat pounding like the rhythm of a distant drum. The second rider arrived, followed by the third. They circled the basin, their frustration growing. Apache woman studied them carefully, her gaze locked on the man who had recognized her as property. She felt the sting of his presence, a reminder of chains she had refused to accept even when bound. Her breath steadied as her mind sharpened. She knew she would fight to the last drop of her blood before allowing them to claim her again. Minutes passed with painful slowness. The riders argued among themselves, gesturing toward different parts of the canyon, trying to decipher tracks that the wind had already begun to erase. Finally, they remounted and rode off in separate directions, their hoofbeats fading like dying thunder. The cowboy remained still, waiting until the last echo dissolved into the desert silence. Only then did he allow himself to breathe again. The woman lowered her stone, her shoulders relaxing slightly. The cowboy wiped the sweat from his brow, but his relief remained cautious. He knew the riders would not give up. They would search until their thirst or tempers broke them. The frontier was unforgiving, but the men who prowled it could be even more relentless. They descended the incline carefully. The horse remained hidden and trembling, but alive. The cowboy stroked its muzzle, whispering calm into its shaking frame. The Apache woman gathered small pieces of brushwood to mask the horse's scent. Together, they prepared to move on. The sun dipped lower in the sky, turning the canyon walls into molten gold. The cowboy looked toward the north, calculating distance and risk. The Apache woman placed her hand on her stomach, reaffirming the vow that now guided her every step. Their paths, once separate, now intertwined with purpose greater than survival. As they prepared to leave the basin and travel deeper into the unknown, the sound of a distant shout echoed faintly, proof that their pursuers were still searching, still hungry, still closing in. The quiet days that followed their arrival at the hidden canyon settled like a warm blanket over both of them, yet beneath the stillness lay a tension neither fully understood. The canyon, with its towering red walls and narrow mouth, became a refuge carved by nature itself. The river that curled along its base gave life to the cottonwoods and the brush that whispered with every passing breeze, offering a sense of peace rare in the wild lands beyond. But peace in the West was often a fleeting luxury, and both Ethan and Nara felt the hourglass draining one grain at a time. Every morning, Ethan rose before the sun cracked open the dark sky and walked the perimeter of the canyon. He would check the soft ground for prints, the rock faces for loose dust, and the narrow entry for anything that suggested they were no longer alone. His exhaustion grew, but he refused to let weariness become a weakness. The truth was simple. He trusted the canyon, but not the world outside it. Nara watched him silently, always from a distance, always with a mixture of gratitude and unease. She felt the weight of her vow, once spoken in desperation, but settled deep in her heart. She owed this man her life. She owed him more than any debt she had carried before, and the promise she had made to repay him with a life, with a child, began pressing against her thoughts with increasing force. She was not sure if such a promise came from duty, tradition, or a stirring within her she had never known before, something shaped not by captivity or survival, but by the tenderness of choice. As the days slipped by, she busied herself with rebuilding strength. She scavenged for roots, dried fruit, herbs, and the remnants of abandoned campsites long forgotten by other Apache families who once sought refuge here. She prepared food, cleaned their gear, and tended the animals with careful, quiet hands. She stayed close enough to Ethan to show respect and distance enough to let him breathe. She had lived most of her life under command, and the freedom to choose her pace was as new to her as it was delicate. Despite her silence, Ethan noticed everything. He noticed the steadiness in her walk returning, the new strength in her arms, the glow returning to her eyes as the bruises and fear faded into memory. He noticed, too, how she slept closer to him each night, without ever crossing the invisible line between obligation and desire. She was near, but never intrusive, respectful but never submissive. It struck him every day how much she carried inside without speaking. There were moments, small ones, when their eyes met and held, when either one might have spoken the words clawing their way up from the heart, but each time something, fear, hesitation, or the weight of the world, pushed the words back down, the tranquility began to shift on the sixth day, subtle at first, like the way the birds flew lower, sweeping close to the canyon floor. The river seemed louder, as if agitated. The sky, usually bright and open, felt pressed down by an invisible hand. Ethan sensed the change before any sign appeared, the instinct of a man who had seen too many peaceful moments turn dangerous without warning. Later that afternoon, he found fresh boot prints near the canyon's entrance, deep, deliberate, and recent. Not one set, but three. The dust was still settling around the edges, meaning no more than an hour separated them. He returned to the camp in silence. Nara felt the shift in him the moment he stepped back into the clearing. His posture was rigid, his face darkened by worry. She already understood what his silence meant. Danger had found them, or was close enough to smell their trail. She stood perfectly still as he gathered the few weapons they carried, checking the revolver, the rifle, and the knife strapped to his belt. He didn't need to speak. She knew. From that moment on, the canyon no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a narrowing trap. Each echo carried a question, each shadow a possibility. Nera's senses sharpened in ways that reminded her of her life before enslavement, when danger was predictable, when enemies were straightforward, and when instincts ruled survival. A part of her awakened that she thought had been beaten out of her by years of captivity. Nightfall came heavy and moonless. Ethan slept lightly, if at all. Nera remained awake, watching the fire's embers blink and fade like dying eyes. She listened to the darkness outside the canyon, the way the wind curled unnaturally along the stone walls. She shifted closer to Ethan without touching him, simply anchoring herself near the only protection she trusted now. Near dawn, a distant sound, metal clicking against rock, reached her ears. Her hand snapped to Ethan's shoulder, shaking him awake before the sound repeated. He rose, instantly, rifle in hand. Voices followed, faint, aggressive, bouncing off the canyon walls. Men, armed men, searching. Ethan cursed himself silently. He had hoped those prints belonged to riders passing through, but he knew now the truth. Someone had tracked them, maybe the ranchers who had held Nera captive, maybe hired hunters, or worse, men who saw profit in capturing an Apache woman and robbing the man who had taken her. The canyon's narrow entry suddenly became a weak point, a funnel for violence. Ethan pulled Nera behind him instinctively. She resisted only long enough to show she had her own instincts, her own readiness, but she understood his protectiveness and did not fight it. When the men finally appeared at the canyon threshold, their outlines distorted by the early morning haze, Ethan realized there were 4, not 3. They spread out, careful, confident, and oblivious to how well the canyon carried their steps. The air thickened as Ethan steadied himself, waiting for the moment tension would snap into violence. Nera crouched beside the brush, breathing slow, eyes sharp. She had no weapon, but her focus was unwavering. The men advanced deeper. Scanning the canyon floor, Ethan waited. When they crossed the deadfall halfway between the entrance and the camp, he stepped forward, rifle raised. Not to shoot, but to draw their attention, to force them to show their hand first. The canyon erupted into chaos. One rider fired prematurely, the shot cracking into stone and sending splinters flying. Ethan dodged behind a boulder and returned fire. The canyon's echo multiplied the sound into rolling thunder, confusing the attackers. Nera watched him fight with the precision of someone who had lived too long under pressure. He moved from cover to cover, using the terrain to his advantage, but he was only one man and his bullets were limited. One of the attackers lunged toward the brush where Nera hid. Thinking he had found something valuable, she darted away, quick and silent, forcing him to expose himself to Ethan's line of sight. A single shot dropped him. Another man circled wide, trying to flank Ethan, but Nera moved again, drawing his focus by scrambling across the slope. He fired at her, missed, and that hesitation cost him. Ethan took him down with a clean, controlled shot. The remaining 2 panicked. They realized the canyon was not the trap they thought. It was Ethan's advantage. They retreated toward the exit, firing wildly behind them. Ethan chased them only far enough to ensure they wouldn't regroup. Then he stopped, out of breath, battered by strain, but alive. Silence fell heavy, absolute. Nera approached him slowly. She saw blood on his arm where a bullet had grazed him. He didn't notice injury yet. His focus was on the dead men, the empty canyon, and the realization that this refuge was now compromised. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken truths. She understood the danger he had placed himself in for her, not once but repeatedly. She understood the promise she had made him was no longer a matter of obligation. It had become a matter of the heart, of devotion, of destiny shaped by the fires of survival and sacrifice. And Ethan understood that keeping her safe would not be as simple as hiding. The world outside was coming for them, and the storm had only begun gathering strength. As the first light of dawn washed over the canyon walls, both knew they had reached the thin edge of fate, a place past which neither could turn back. The story of their survival had entered its final chapter. The rising sun cast a thin golden haze across the canyon walls, but its warmth did little to soften the weight that settled over Ethan and Nara. Lifeless bodies of the men who had tracked them lay stiff near the canyon's throat, marking the spot where danger had forced its way in and where Ethan had stopped it with grit and instinct. Quiet that followed the gunfire had felt like a blessed relief at first, but as dawn matured, that quiet shifted into something else, something heavier, more foreboding. Both of them understood that the men lying in the dust would not be the last to come. In the west, violence never remained hidden for long. Gunshots echoed far, missing men drew questions, trails were followed, and debts were always collected by someone: bandits, ranchers, or the mercenaries who lingered around every settlement waiting for a chance to profit from misery. Ethan knew they had days at most before others picked up the trail. The canyon had protected them once, but it was no longer the safe haven it had seemed. He spent the morning burying the bodies far from the canyon's entrance, digging graves in hard, packed dirt that resisted his every effort. Sweat dripped from his brow, soaking the ground beneath his boots. His wounded arm ached, and his vision blurred once or twice, but he pressed on relentlessly. He could not leave the remains for scavengers to scatter or for the sun to rot. He would not give their pursuers an easy trail by leaving carnage behind. Nara watched him from a distance, her heart tightening with each strike of his shovel. The sound carried across the canyon like the tolling of a bell. She saw the strain in his shoulders, the trembling in his posture. Exhaustion etched deeply into his movements. She also saw what he refused to admit. He was pushing himself beyond his limits because the danger was now greater than either of them had expected. She approached only when he finished the last grave, stepping toward him lightly, her feet barely disturbing the dust. He leaned on the shovel for a moment, drawing in uneven breaths. She stood beside him, not touching him, but close enough for her presence to steady the space around them. In that quiet moment, a certainty settled deep inside her, something she had been fighting, resisting, or misunderstanding from the very beginning. Her promise to him, spoken in desperation after he spent his last dollar to buy her freedom, had grown roots inside her. It was no longer a vow born from fear or cultural obligation. It had transformed into a truth she felt with every beat of her heart. Ethan had given everything for her, not because he sought payment, not because he expected a reward, but because he could not walk away from someone who needed saving. His kindness was as rare as rainfall in the dry seasons. It had shaped her, changed her, and taught her that life after captivity could hold more than survival. It could hold honor. It could hold loyalty. It could hold tenderness of a kind she had never known. As they walked back to the camp in silence, she glanced at him through the corner of her eye. His steps were slow, but determined. His jaw was set in quiet resolve. She sensed the pain in his arm, hidden behind layers of stubbornness and grit. When they reached the camp, he sank beside the fire pit to clean his wound. She knelt beside him and took the cloth from his hand before he could protest. He let her tend to the injury without objection. Her fingers were steady as she washed away dried blood, applied crushed herbs for pain, and wrapped the wound with strips of clean cloth she had prepared earlier. Her movements carried the gentleness of someone who had learned to survive but had not forgotten how to heal. As she worked, Ethan looked at her with an expression that carried a depth he had never spoken aloud. In that shared silence, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of everything they had endured and everything they had yet to face. When his bandage was secured, Nara rose and walked toward the canyon's mouth. She looked out at the narrowing gap, at the land stretching beyond it, wild and unforgiving. She understood the truth that rested at the heart of their predicament. The canyon was no longer enough to keep them safe. They needed a future shaped not by hiding but by standing firmly beside one another. That afternoon, Ethan gathered their supplies. He packed lightly, knowing the journey ahead required speed. The Horses were restless but strong, sensing the rising tension. Nera helped secure the saddlebags, tightening straps and adjusting gear. Neither spoke, but both moved with a shared purpose. When the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of crimson and ash, they rode out of the canyon together. The world beyond felt enormous, its vastness reminding them of every danger lurking unseen. Yet it also offered a promise, a new beginning forged by their shared struggle. They traveled through the night, stopping only when the horses needed rest. Ethan's arm throbbed, but he ignored the pain. Nera remained close, her presence a quiet anchor. They kept to the ridges, avoiding open plains where riders could spot them from a distance. By dawn, they reached a stretch of land where the mesquite trees thickened around a shallow creek. The water shimmered with early light. Exhaustion finally pressed too heavily on them to continue. They dismounted and settled beneath the branches. Ethan rested, leaning back against the trunk of a tree. Nera sat across from him, watching the way his eyes softened as fatigue overtook his usual alertness. She realized he had risked everything, his fortune, his safety, his life, to protect her from a fate she would have never escaped alone. Her vow returned to her, filling her chest with warmth and gravity. She had promised him a life, she had promised him a child, not as a transaction, not as repayment, but because in giving him that promise, she had acknowledged something profound, that she wanted her future to be tied to his, that she wanted the life growing inside her heart to begin with a man who had shown her respect, dignity, and the kind of courage the world rarely offered. Her decision was no longer tied to debt, it was tied to choice, it was tied to him. Hours passed. Ethan awoke slowly, his eyes steady, his strength returning in the quiet of the shaded grove. They continued riding, putting miles between themselves and the canyon. By midday, the land softened into rolling plains dotted with wildflowers. The horizon widened, offering space to breathe. When they finally stopped again, stillness around them felt different, less tense, more accepting. Ethan set up a small camp with careful hands, and Nera prepared a meal with quiet concentration. They worked together with a comfort that felt natural, born from fire and danger but blooming now in peace. As evening fell, painting the sky in soft gold, Nera approached Ethan where he stood looking across the open plains. Her steps were calm, her heart steady. She paused beside him and breathed deeply, letting certainty settle into her bones. In her mind, she formed the truth she had carried across miles of fear and hope, that her promise would be kept not because she owed him, but because her spirit had chosen him as the man worthy of sharing her life and bearing her future. The story of their bond had begun in rescue, but it would continue in devotion. Night spread across the plains, wide and quiet. The danger behind them had not vanished completely, but ahead stretched a horizon wide enough to hold a future. Shaped by the strength they carried together, their journey had carved something unbreakable between them, something deeper than debt, stronger than survival. And in that wide, untamed world, their new life began.